it doesn't seem to go anywhere. As you say, it looks like Trump will be the nominee. It looks like he'll end up running against Biden. And it looks like these cases will be fascinating, but they won't actually have that great of an impact.
And Donald Trump has been disqualified from standing in the Republican primary in the state of Maine. It's the second state to do so. Maine's Secretary of State, Shanna Bellows, explained the decision.
I am so mindful, and I said this in my decision, that it is unprecedented. No Secretary of State has ever deprived a presidential candidate of ballot access based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. But no presidential candidate has ever engaged in insurrection and been disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment.
Well, the ruling can be appealed, and it only applies to the March primary election, the Republican primary, but it could potentially affect Donald Trump's status for the November presidential election. David Katz is a former assistant U.S. attorney and criminal defense attorney in Beverly Hills, and we often turn to him to make sense of the complexities of U.S. politics. Good morning, David.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
Sometimes it's very easy to lose track of all the various legal problems facing Donald Trump. Just talk us through what this relates to.
Well, this is not one of his federal criminal cases. This is not one of his two state criminal cases. I say there's two federal cases and two state criminal cases. These are not those cases. These are efforts to first get the Secretary of State of the individual states. You know, we have 50 of them, and they all vote separately. And then there's the Electoral College. It's very complicated for other people, but we vote as states. And in each state, the presidential candidate, first for the primary, has to be put on the ballot. And then in the general election, the nominee of the Republican Party faces the nominee of the Democratic Party. That's usually determinative and has been for a long, long time in this country. So you have two different questions. One is, has the presidential candidate gotten due process? And what's interesting about Colorado is that looks like a case where Trump did get due process. He had a trial. He put on witnesses. The judge found against him. Then that went to the Colorado Supreme Court, the highest court in Colorado, which said that he was an officer at the time that he engaged in the insurrection, and therefore the trial judge was wrong on that, but she was right on everything else, that he had engaged in insurrection, and that's the case that's going to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. The main decision, like the California decision, which also just came out, is a decision of a Secretary of State whether to put on the ballot or not put on the ballot Trump. In Maine, this Secretary of State just decided to not put Trump on the ballot. In California, the Secretary of State declined to remove Trump from the ballot in California. The reason that Maine is so significant is, first, it's a purple state. It's a state that if Trump's not on the ballot, he might have won, but being off the ballot, he would lose. He certainly would not win it. So that's the complexity. But both of those cases, the one in Maine that just came out and the one in California, will be challenged in the courts. And so to get to the stage that Colorado is, this Maine decision by the Secretary of State would have to go all the way through the courts. Trump would have to get due process. And that's why I think the main thing your listeners should realize is that this puts pressure on the Supreme Court of the United States to take the state case from Colorado, which most people think will result in Trump not being removed from the ballot. And it's the primary ballot only. It still is up in the air whether Trump will be removed. If he does somehow win the primary in these states, will he be allowed to go up against Biden? That may be a totally different question for our courts. Have I confused everyone or enlightened them?
Well, no, you've done a marvellous job there, David, of trying to make sense of it all. I suppose the crucial question is, will this mean Donald Trump can run in states like Maine in the presidential election? Because if he's barred from running in one or two states in the Republican primary, frankly, that probably won't make much of a difference. He's way out in front. He's almost certain to win the nomination. Will it actually affect the general election in November?
Well, that's going to depend on what these states do regarding, that issue. And in Colorado, it looks like that may actually keep him off the ballot. But as you say, it's not a state that he was going to win. So the rubber will really hit the road if the U.S. Supreme Court doesn't decisively decide this issue promptly. The issue, if the Supreme Court doesn't move in and do that, then it will embolden Democrats in the states that are really in play to demand that their Secretary of States and their attorneys general be more aggressive about trying to get Trump off the ballot. The other thing that may happen is that his challengers will use that and say, well, wait a second, he's in danger of not being the nominee against Biden. And I would be. I could face Biden in all 50 states and be on the ballot and have no problem. But the reality is Haley's tried to make that argument, or her supporters have. It doesn't seem to go anywhere. As you say, it looks like Trump will be the nominee. It looks like he'll end up running against Biden. And it looks like these cases will be fascinating, but they won't actually have that great of an impact. I don't mean to disappoint your listeners who've been probably avidly wanting me to say that it would have much more of an impact. But I just think it's going to end up being Trump, the nominee, running in all 50 states and being allowed to run against Biden in all 50 states, either because I think the Supreme Court's going to get involved in some way. They're going to say this is all a political question, which shouldn't be resolved by the courts. But, the hard thing about saying that is that these are state courts, and we decide the president state by state. And why is the federal government getting involved in what some state does? Presumably because Trump will have convinced them that there's a federal question, that he has a federal right, and his voters have a federal right to vote for the particular person, whether he's supposedly an insurrectionist or not. You get me?
Yeah.
There's a federal right to not have that issue decided state by state by these states, because it would undermine the choice of the Trump voters and of Trump to run. And I just think that this will not ultimately impact the outcome of the election. I think people ought to go to the polls, and if they don't like Trump, try to beat him, organize and try to beat him at the polls.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Just finally, David, on the politics of all of this, won't this just play into the narrative that Donald Trump is trying to spin, that he's the victim of some kind of stitch-up?
Well, he's made that narrative, but I think people should stand back from it and say, we all saw what happened on January 6th. We saw him giving those inflammatory speeches. We saw him, even before that, try to monkey around with the slates. We saw him tell his supporters to come to, Washington and be wild. And then he didn't tamp down the insurrection for 3.5 hours as the whole world saw it going on. And he sent out an inflammatory tweet in the middle of it, or social media post in the middle of it, that actually threatened Pence while they were threatening to hang Pence, the marauders in the Capitol. So people say to themselves, my God, if this was not an insurrection, what was, and what is the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution talking about in barring an insurrectionist, unless it meant barring an insurrectionist just like Trump? So, yes, it's going to play into the polarization and the political fights that we have here. And I think all of your listeners can draw their own conclusions, especially if they saw what happened on TV and the run-up to January 6th in the United States.
David, as ever, thank you so much for helping us make sense of it all.